Welcome to our discussion of the presidency, a lecture I call From the Presidency to the President, which means we originally envisioned all the power being wrapped up in the office itself, and now a lot of the power is wrapped up in the actual individual person, whoever happens to be the president. So, in the original conception of how our presidency would work, the founders thought to themselves, we need to make sure the executive has enough power to get stuff done that he needs to get done. We call that executive energy. So first of all, we're going to make it only one person. They had originally argued maybe it should be a council of 5, but we decided on one, and that unity gives him some authority and power. We decided to give him enough time in office, 4 years, where people in government would have to listen to what he has to say. We made sure we would pay him and make sure his staff had enough salary and money to get done what they needed to get done. And make sure that somehow constitutionally there are enough powers for him to accomplish whatever it is an executive needs to accomplish. Note that these are characteristics of the office itself. The founders wanted all the power wrapped up in the bubble of the E bubble in our three legislative, executive, and judicial branch, all wrapped up in the institution itself. And that way it wouldn't matter who was going to be president. It could be some nerdy dude, some powerful guy, some clerk. They step into the role and they have the power based on the institution. So our Constitution gives a very vague sense of what these powers will be. It is our second article, and it says that all power will be vested in the president. It's a weird form of vocabulary to use, and it's fairly vague. But we want the president to be a check on popular power. Sometimes we want the president to say no to the majority. That we call the veto. And we want the legislative branch to be where the majority power is. That's how they make decisions, majority rule. So the founders envisioned that L bubble, the legislature, to be dominated by people arguing over who gets what and taking their time to make decisions. That's the whole point of debate on the floor of the Congress and the Senate. And in arguing over who gets what and who deserves the bridge or the money, they're making arguments about what is just, what is deserved. The presidency, on the other hand, is very different. His job is to repel external threats, meaning be commander-in-chief, but also to put down internal threats. So that presidential power has to be different in source and character than the legislative power. So the founders did not want you directly electing the president, because if the majority picks the president, how can the president tell the majority no with his veto? It doesn't make sense. So originally there were secret electors. So how did we choose candidates? Well, there's no primaries, there's no campaigns, so candidates, basically presidents like George Washington, John Adams, all those early guys, were chosen just based on reputation. What kind of reputation? Well, they better have served the nation, otherwise they're not going to occur to these secret electors that are spread out through the states. So these secret electors have to, in December, when they go to the state capitol and write down a couple names, they have to be able to think of somebody who's done something for the entire nation, and not somebody that's just done something locally. And keep in mind, the ability to look like you have a good haircut or kiss babies just doesn't matter to the original conception of the presidency. It's only your national service. And your ability to campaign is also irrelevant. So we get our first couple presidents who fit this mold. Things start to change in the election of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson and his new party, the Democratic Republicans, sweep into power and basically take over government. Everybody becomes Democratic Republicans, so we don't yet have political parties. But we get a few other presidents that sort of fit this mold in Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. But the problem is, by the time 1824 happens, the ability for all these secret electors to think of the same person, the same national hero, is gone because the Revolutionary War generation is starting to die out. So we have a problem. We get a whole mess in 1800 where actually Jefferson and Aaron Burr tie, and the presidency gets kicked into the House. If no president gets a majority of electoral votes, it gets kicked to the House of Representatives, which were filled with old Federalists. They had some debates. Eventually they chose Jefferson over Burr. Burr got to be vice president. But Burr carried some anger about those dealings, and the guy who had organized those dealings was Alexander Hamilton. Eventually Burr shoots, this is the point of the picture here, Burr shoots Alexander Hamilton. That's how Alexander Hamilton, one of our genius founders, that's how he dies. Not just over the anger for the president-vice presidency thing, probably some chance that Alexander Hamilton had messed around with Burr's wife. That's sort of the reputation he had. So after that mess, we decided we better split that ballot and just say one of the things you write down, secret elector, will be for president, one will be for vice president. Up until then, these secret electors just went to the state capitol and secretly wrote down 2 names. And hopefully, out of all the secret electors, somebody showed up on a majority of ballots somewhere, line 1 or 2. But when they tied and we had that mess with Burr and Jefferson, and eventually Hamilton's death, we said, let's separate it and say president is one line, vice president is another. The problem is, it's much less likely that your name shows up on a majority of ballots on the right line. We just cut the odds in half that somebody out of the blue in the secret electors' minds would show up on a majority of ballots. And as I just mentioned, if there's no majority of electoral votes, the election goes into the House, and the House represents majority opinion, and we want the president to tell the majority no sometimes. So we have a big constitutional problem. We also get sick of this secret electors thing. We think it looks pretty undemocratic, and indeed it is. The founders didn't like democracy, but by 1824, we've got a lot of states deciding, let's choose who these electors are. And so what do you do to say I should be chosen to go write down a couple names? I have good handwriting. There's not a lot of other things you could do other than say, choose me to be elector because I'm going to go write down Andrew Jackson. And then people say, well, why is that good? And then you end up explaining why Andrew Jackson is good. Thus, this is the beginning of our modern campaigns. Here we inject the beginning of our party system, our 2 political parties, because as Van Buren, the guy behind the scenes of eventually President Jackson, saw, this mess with the secret electors and the majority voting and the House of Representatives, this whole mess is not going away. So he said, you know what would help that go away and make sure there are some majority electoral votes? If we only have 2 options. So if we just have Democrat and Republican, one of them will get the majority of electoral votes, most likely. The entering of the parties makes our presidents have to be loyal to parties because parties are going to choose who gets to be the candidate. That's still somewhat how we do it today. It makes these presidents pretty boring because they are no longer national war heroes. They're just party hacks, guys that are good at weaseling around in the party. It's kind of hard to even name some of the ones in between Jackson and Lincoln that fit this era. They're boring. So basically we divide the presidency into 3 main eras. That first era of choosing the president based on secret electors and putting all the power into the office itself we'll give to Hamilton. He was the genius behind a lot of what we thought about the executive. And here the president could be just a clerk, once in a while being commander-in-chief, but mostly just saying no to the majority occasionally. The next era, when we have the introduction of political parties and political machines, and we start choosing who these electors are, we call the Jacksonian era. It's the guy who popped up in this era. And the last era we call the Wilsonian era. If you care about this YouTube link, you can go watch some stuff about Wilson. But here's where our modern presidency comes into the picture. This is about early 1900s. And Wilson says, you know what? I'm the only one that should be voted by all the people. And we have the transition from secret electors in the Hamiltonian era to choosing the electors in the Jacksonian era. And by the time we get to the Wilsonian era, we have the mess that we have today, where we still have the Electoral College, but who those electors write down in their 2 lines at the state capitol in December is determined by the individual states' popular votes. So we now choose our presidents by popular vote, which completely undermines the whole founders' deal about the president representing minority interests. But we still have the legacy of these secret electors, which is why we have this Electoral College stuff that most Americans don't understand why it exists at all. And there's some argument that maybe it shouldn't exist anymore, considering it's just the remnants of this old way of doing things. So the modern president, as embodied by Wilson, is chosen by the majority. And we expect presidents to do a lot. If I asked you to list things, go ahead on a piece of paper, pause this video, list all the things you expect a president to do, and then go ahead and list all the new things we added to the Constitution to give that president more power. And you get none. We added no new powers, but we expect the president to do everything, do something about the economy, education. We expect basically an office designed to be run as a clerk. We expect him to be the most powerful man on the planet. And so there is a shortage of constitutional powers. Here's a little graph economics-wise. If you have demand, which is the slanting down to the right, versus supply, when you have more demand than there is supply, you have a shortage. You don't need to understand this graph. It's just an economics way of saying the president does not have the supply of powers he needs to meet the demands of what we expect of him. So he's got to look for power somewhere. One of the main areas political scientists write about is that presidents use their personality and ability to persuade to get extra power. A really good book written by Richard Neustadt about LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and how persuasive he was. He could bring people into his office, put his arm around him and go, all right, buddy, we're going to get some stuff done I want, and use this power to push things through Congress that he needed. Also, we call this the second one, going over the heads of Congress. The president is the only one who, as Wilson pointed out, can appeal to all the people at once. He can just show up on TV and go, hey, I'm the president, I'm talking to you. Congress is trying to screw things up. Push on Congress. Write your congressman and make them do what I say we should do. So the president uses that to get extra power. He also uses his power as a figurehead, meaning he's a celebrity. He's our national leader. I often tell the story of going to LA one year back when Paris Hilton was famous, and I ran into her at a fancy club and cheersed her. And the next day when I saw her in a car, she said, hey, and I said, hey, and then she drove off really fast, really fast, and I said, oh, she's so cool. And all my friends were like, what did you say? And I had been temporarily blinded by her celebrity. Well, the same thing is true of the president. He's one of the most famous, if not the most famous person on the planet, and he can use that celebrity and the aura of the White House and the Oval Office that senators come in. There's many stories back when George W. Bush was president that Democratic senators who hated him would come in the office, he'd hang out with them in the Oval Office, and they'd leave saying to themselves, much like I did, he's so cool. And, oh, wait, what am I doing? But celebrity can cloud judgment, and presidents use that celebrity to their advantage. The last one here is executive prerogative. Executive prerogative comes from a simple political problem, and that is that when things go wrong and we are most in danger, we look to the government to do something. And most of the government is not designed to act quickly, except for the president. So in times of emergency, we will give almost unlimited power to our executive. And that's a problem. We don't really have a good way to limit that power. In times of emergency, we will let the president do just about anything he wants. We tried to limit that in this War Powers Act of 1973, and most people know about this. If there's some problem in Iraq or somewhere in the world, the president can send troops and do whatever he wants without listening to Congress for a certain amount of time. And we care about this because we all know this as Americans, and so it does have some power. Constitutionally speaking, this law probably wouldn't hold up. You cannot have Congress able to make laws about the executive. That's a separation of powers issue. Otherwise, Congress would just say the president has to do what we tell the president to do. Right? That doesn't make any sense. So this act has power because we all know the 60, 90-day rule. But constitutionally speaking, if a president really wanted to just keep doing what he wanted, probably wouldn't have much to stop him, and that's scary. And that power is called executive prerogative. And so we should expect presidents to use executive prerogative a lot because it gives them extra power. Being a wartime president gives you a lot more power. And the genius of this, or the danger of it, or the scariest part about it, is that the executive has ultimate power in times of emergency. Well, who defines what an emergency is? The executive. So we have sort of a logical loop here that is dangerous for us. So hopefully you understand something about how the power has shifted from the office itself to who the person is, personal characteristics, his hair, his power persuasion, his ability to act like a celebrity. The office has also increased in magnitude as America, through foreign policy and economic development, has become the most powerful nation on the planet. Being the president is a really hard job. There are a lot of paradoxes. We want him to be strong, but we don't want him to be too strong. We expect him to be an average Joe, somebody you want to have a beer with. But you cannot become president being an average Joe. You have to be more charismatic than almost anybody. We expect him to be nonpartisan, but he's got to work with his party, so he has to be a master partisan. We expect him to unite the nation, but his job, according to the Constitution, is to tell the majority no and take unpopular stands. We expect him to lead, but also listen to the people. We want him self-confident, but if he's arrogant, that's no good. Also, a big problem is what it takes to win the campaign may not be the same as what it takes to be a good governor. That's a really big contemporary problem for political science. So, ask yourself what some of these most important personal qualities are in terms of what it takes for you to vote for somebody, for a candidate to win a campaign, and what it takes to actually be a good president. Would you rather have a scoundrel who gets stuff done or a saint who doesn't get much done? Another really difficult question when we think about what do we expect most of presidents, to represent the nation or to get stuff done. Here are several other presidential qualities that almost every president has to have to be a functioning president. Communication, organization, some skill, some ability to present a vision for the future, and some emotional intelligence. Sort of picture Clinton with his thumb saying, "I feel your pain." Here's some last thoughts about how much the president earns. He now earns about $400,000. Students usually care to hear about how much they earn. The vice president earns $208,100. Pretty random number. My guess is there's some country club in D.C. where the annual price tag is $8,100. Otherwise, I'm not sure what that random total comes from. Who do you like? Who are your favorite presidents? Let's keep going. Let's power through and talk about the rest of what makes up the E-bubble, the executive branch, and that is the huge bureaucracy that exists underneath it. The problem with the bureaucracy is that it is filled with people who make decisions that are not elected. That's a big democratic problem. Think about all the different buildings in D.C., just about every building you can think of, the Treasury, Justice Department, State Department, all those departments, those are all pieces of the executive branch that we call the bureaucracy. We elect the president, but everybody else in that bureaucracy are, well, at least today, civil servants. They are unelected officials, and they wield a huge amount of power over our lives. So we have different arguments as to why it's okay. In the earliest era, we went to different communities and picked the pillars of the community. We said, hey, you're a good gentleman, come to D.C. and work in the bureaucracy. And we justified that power by saying, well, at least those guys are considering how their rules will affect their community. The next era, we decided, no, we are going to fill these positions with the people who help us get elected. This is called patronage. So this is the era of party politics popping up on the screen as we talked about when we talked about Jacksonian presidency. So if you help me get elected, I'll give you a job in the bureaucracy. So common guys got to have the job, and this was really handy in justifying the power, because if you didn't like how the bureaucracy worked, vote for a different president, at least the other party, and they will sweep out all those old people and put in all new people. The problem is a lot of common men can't do the job that has to be done in the bureaucracy. They're difficult jobs. There's a lot of turnover. That can't be good for efficiency. And with all that turnover, we get some level of chaos. So in 1883, we passed the Pendleton Act, which gets rid of patronage because it looks corrupt. It's like giving jobs to your cousin. That's no good. All that spoil system stuff you may have learned in high school. So we passed the Pendleton Act, which says if you want to work for the government, you have to pass an exam. We call it the civil service exam. And so now we have civil servants in that they have to take this exam. In this era, we justified the power by saying, well, at least they're qualified for their jobs. Still, not great to have people qualified but wielding power that are not elected. Our next era of justification is to say, well, don't worry, they're not going to make decisions based on what they want. They're simply going to execute the law in the most efficient way possible. So let's say the legislative branch makes a law, comes out of the L bubble, and the law is clean water. Well, that law has to be executed by the executive branch. So it goes to the appropriate part of the bureaucracy, in this case the EPA, and the EPA translates that law about clean water into the codes of how much different companies can pollute. So here the argument would be, don't worry, we'll execute that law in the most efficient way possible. Still not great, because those decisions about those codes affect our lives pretty seriously. In 1937, we had a study done of the bureaucracy because it had grown so large, and that study, called the Brownlow Commission, found that the bureaucracy is too big for the president to know what's going on. And so heads of those different agencies would have to make decisions, day-to-day decisions, like the director of the FBI has to make decisions day-to-day on how to run that agency. He has to be an administrator, not just a manager for the president. But since then, we've been wrestling with this problem. How do we deal with the fact that our bureaucracy is so large and has so much power over our lives, but is not directly democratically elected? It's a big problem.